In June of 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed a piece of legislation that his own advisors begged him to veto. Over 1,000 economists sent him an open letter warning him it would be catastrophic. Foreign governments threatened immediate retaliation. The financial press called it economic suicide. He signed it anyway. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised taxes on over 20,000 imported goods to the highest levels in American history. The logic was simple and seductive. Protect American workers, keep foreign goods out, keep American money at home. Within 3 years, global trade had collapsed by 66%. 25% of Americans were unemployed. Banks across the country were failing at the rate of hundreds per month. The Great Depression, already underway, had been transformed from a serious recession into a civilizational catastrophe. The mechanism was not complicated. It never is. It just requires enough political will to ignore what history already knows. This is precedent, and today we are drawing the line. To understand what Smoot-Hawley actually did, you need to understand the world it entered. By 1930, the global economy was already under severe stress. The stock market crash of October 1929 had wiped out billions in paper wealth. Banks had tightened credit. Consumer spending was falling. The United States, as the world's largest economy, was the load-bearing wall of the global financial system. What happened in America echoed everywhere. Into that fragile moment, Congress introduced a tariff bill that had been quietly working its way through committee for over a year. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon had designed it primarily to protect American farmers. Grain prices had collapsed after World War I and rural America was suffering. The bill started as targeted agricultural protection and ballooned, as political deals always do, into comprehensive protection for every domestic industry with a lobbyist. The final bill raised average tariffs on imported goods to nearly 50%. Some specific goods faced tariffs of over 100%. The immediate response was exactly what those 1,000 economists had warned about. Canada retaliated first, then Britain, then France, then Germany. Country after country raised their own tariffs on American goods. American exports, which in 1929 had been the engine of agricultural and manufacturing prosperity, collapsed. Farmers who had been protected by the tariff on imports suddenly found their export markets had evaporated. The cure had made the disease terminal. Between 1929 and 1933, American exports fell from $5.2 billion to $1.7 billion. Global trade fell by 2/3. The integrated world economy that had been built over decades was, in the span of 3 years, dismantled. Here is the mechanism that the history books often understate, and that makes the Smoot-Hawley story directly relevant to every trade war that has followed it, including the one happening right now. Tariffs do not simply reduce imports, they trigger retaliation. And retaliation triggers counter-retaliation. Each round of escalation destroys another layer of the trading relationships that took decades to build. The escalation cycle has a predictable structure: unilateral action, partner retaliation, domestic political pressure to respond to the retaliation, further escalation, and once it begins, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop because the domestic political cost of backing down exceeds the economic cost of continuing. This is the trap Smoot and Hawley built and Hoover walked into. By the time the economic damage was undeniable, the political logic of retreat had become impossible. Admitting the tariffs had caused the damage meant admitting the policy had been a catastrophic mistake. Governments rarely do that voluntarily. The second mechanism is what economists call demand destruction. When tariffs raise the price of imported goods, consumers pay more. That sounds like a minor inconvenience until you scale it across an entire economy. Every dollar a consumer spends on a tariff-inflated domestic product is a dollar not spent somewhere else. Aggregate demand, the total spending that keeps an economy moving, contracts. Businesses facing reduced consumer spending, cut production. Cut production means cut workers. Cut workers means further reduced consumer spending. The spiral accelerates. The Federal Reserve, rather than loosening monetary policy to offset the demand destruction, raised interest rates in 1931 to defend the gold standard. The combination, tariff-driven demand contraction plus monetary tightening, was devastating. It is now considered the textbook case study in how not to respond to an economic downturn. Herbert Hoover, who had been one of the most celebrated technocrats of his era, a mining engineer, a brilliant logistician who had fed war-ravaged Europe after World War I, left office with unemployment at 25% and his name permanently attached to the shantytown camps of homeless Americans that sprang up across the country. Hoovervilles. The political cost of the trade war was paid for a generation. Now let's talk about today. The current tariff escalation between the United States and its trading partners follows the Smoot-Hawley pattern with a precision that should be making economic historians deeply uncomfortable. The structure is identical. Tariffs imposed unilaterally on strategic goods: steel, aluminum, semiconductors, consumer electronics. Trading partners retaliate with targeted tariffs on American agricultural exports: soybeans, pork, wheat, specifically chosen to inflict maximum political pain on the domestic constituencies that supported the original tariffs. American farmers, the same demographic Smoot-Hawley claimed to protect in 1930, find their export markets contracting as a direct consequence of the trade policy designed to help them. The scale is different. The integrated global supply chains of 2025 are orders of magnitude more complex than those of 1930. A single semiconductor chip passes through multiple countries in its production process before it reaches the device it powers. Tariffs on components ripple through supply chains in ways that are difficult to model and even more difficult to reverse. American manufacturers who rely on imported components face cost increases that cannot be offset by tariffs on finished foreign goods. The tariffs simultaneously raise their input costs and reduce their export competitiveness. The consumer price mechanism is identical to 1930. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are paid by American importers and pass through to American consumers. The distributional impact falls disproportionately on lower-income households who spend a higher percentage of their income on goods rather than services. This is not a contested empirical claim. It is a documented consequence of every major tariff imposition in economic history. The political trap is identical. Once tariffs are imposed and trading partners retaliate, the domestic narrative becomes one of fighting back against retaliation rather than acknowledging that the original tariffs caused the retaliation. The escalation cycle develops its own political momentum, independent of the underlying economic logic. Here is where the Smoot-Hawley story ends, and what that ending tells us about where this one goes. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs were not repealed until 1934 under Franklin Roosevelt through the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. By then, the damage was done. The Depression had deepened for 4 years. The international trading order that had been built over decades had been shattered. The political consequences of that shattered order, the rise of economic nationalism in Europe, the collapse of the German economy and the conditions that brought the Nazi Party to power, the militarization of Japan, were still playing out a decade later on the beaches of Normandy and the atolls of the Pacific. Trade wars are rarely contained to economics. The economic damage they cause produces political instability. Political instability produces leaders who find external enemies a more useful explanation than internal policy failures. External enemies produce military conflict. This is not an inevitable chain, but it is a historically recurring one, and Smoot-Hawley sits at the beginning of the most catastrophic iteration of it in modern history. The lesson is not that trade should be free in all circumstances or that protecting domestic industries is never legitimate. The lesson is specific and empirical. Tariffs imposed unilaterally without a framework for resolution trigger retaliation, retaliation triggers escalation, and escalation has systemic costs that dwarf whatever benefit the original tariffs were designed to produce. 1,000 economists told Herbert Hoover this in 1930. He signed the bill anyway. The question precedent always asks is not whether history will repeat. It asks whether the people making decisions today have read enough of it to recognize the pattern before the consequences arrive. Precedent. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. If this video made you think, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The past is still happening. We just haven't recognized it yet.